going back to this prevention planning and how that might aid the way that churches respond to a victim and the victim's family.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Super helpful information. By the way, there's a great resource that Telios has shared. It's called an Abuse Allegation Response Checklist, and it can be found on the ECAP resources page. And so as you're thinking through how to respond, you want a quick reference guide. That is a helpful tool that many have used. You're exactly right in caring for victims. Again, those commitments, those broad principles are now being tested, right? And so having a list of trauma-informed providers, therapists, counselors to be able to respond if and when something happens is really, really important. Also thinking through the philosophical aspects of your church or ministry and how to take those, your doctrine, your philosophy, and work that into providing trauma-informed care for victims, family, but there's others that may need some care as well, and that might involve any other staff, volunteers, workers who may have been impacted through the allegation of abuse. And so really think through comprehensively the victim, of course, the family, and others who may need help. Again, at ECAP, we would love to challenge all of you to think through these things in advance with a response plan. Have your legal counsel phone number, that person identified, the attorney identified to provide that kind of legal guide and care, not when something happens, but in advance. Identify that spokesperson who's going to represent the ministry publicly. Obviously, safety is important. I want to emphasize that at this point as well. So if there's someone who's been harmed, we want to make sure that we remove them immediately from the situation as we get into reporting. There's some helpful resources in the chat there from Church Law and Tax. There's specific training for mandatory reporting that I'd check out, and also search the mandatory reporting laws in your state through the link that's been provided there.
That's great. Well, great resources. I'm seeing some of the questions and people are hungry for resources. And so hopefully we can provide those when they're general, and then get more specific as folks need to, whether it's through your counsel in your own state or making plugs for different things. One resource that I think we've all found very valuable as attorneys is through Christian Legal Society, where we regularly help lawyers to be able to address these kind of questions. And so that might be another resource for finding an attorney. But focusing here on the victim care, I think in my years of practice in this area, it has been very heartening to see that churches are more and more attentive to victim care, and that is part of a comprehensive approach. It's part of ECAP's approach, and any good child protection policy, maybe not in the policy itself, but as some part of that care. And so very commendable. You don't want to treat that as an afterthought. And I have seen, I think of one church in particular, where the church was so fantastic caring for the perpetrator in dealing with that person's sin issues that were very extensive, and keeping things fairly quiet from a risk management perspective. But unfortunately, when something happened on social media and it all busted up, the outcry, it was so hard. Hear these leaders trying to do everything they can. It was very much church discipline, very in accordance with biblical standards. But the impression was, well, what did you ever do for the victims? And the victim of this particular thing was now an adult. But the question was, is this person going to be hurting my children or, other people within the church? And so it looked like this church was out of balance. And I think it's because they just put so much energy into this perpetrator who confessed sin, and they did not do as much for the victim. And so they're having some very significant fallout from that, and some potentially pretty serious harm to the ministry. So, what else can we do? We mentioned that some counseling, trauma-informed counseling, somebody who's, very able to help the victim, to help the parents and the family with resources that are in the community. Some other just very practical advice to check in from time to time with the victim and their family. They can feel very abandoned after this initial rush of help, getting them out of the way, but they're still dealing with the trauma. They're not talking about biblical discipline for them, because that's over in the perpetrator department maybe, but how are they being cared for on an ongoing basis, whether it's through, referrals to professionals, checking in, and maybe even, if your church doesn't have a benevolence policy, to have one and make financial assistance or other support available to pay for these service providers. That's a very appropriate thing to do for a church, depending on its resources. And then the last thing from all this, as you're maybe taking notes or thinking about what you do or you don't do, how you can improve, but seriously consider what can you learn or do differently to nurture this culture of caring for all the congregants and people who are affected. Maybe the victim is somebody who wasn't a regular attender, but what does it mean to be ministry and to learn from what bad thing has happened so that you can be more effective as a church?
Building on, again, Sally's comments, I would say one thing. We talked about reporting to law enforcement. There may be a time you also have to report to the insurance company. And the reason I bring that in there is because insurance companies often will cover costs for counseling victims. And so this would be a time where you may have additional resources to help the victims through the insurance that you have. Having represented many victims of sexual abuse over the years, it's imperative that churches have programs and people to help victims of abuse in order to heal emotionally, spiritually, and otherwise. I said earlier, treat them as Jesus would treat them. And the same thing with the alleged perpetrator, or in this case, even if he's convicted a perpetrator, treat them accordingly as Jesus would treat them. One little note I would mention, which is a whole nother webinar, which I'm not going into, and that is people have always asked me, and it's now becoming a large issue, and that is, how do I integrate these sex offenders who have repented and become Christians? How do I bring them back into the church? I'm saying, first, you can look at the article that's on ECAP or on our website. There are a couple articles that I've written on how to effectively do that and when you should, when you shouldn't do that. But be aware that as you do that, there most likely are victims of child abuse in your church. Not maybe from this perpetrator, but in general. And you need to be considering, how is this going to impact them when I bring this person who's repentant and changed back into the church under very strong and strict guidelines? How is that going to impact them as victims? And what triggers will this incur in them?
Yeah, those are excellent points. So some further thoughts about caring for victims. Victim care, victim advocacy, that's pretty specialized. So even for counselors, they need to be certified in trauma-informed care. There's different courses and certifications. So it shouldn't just be any counselor who's working with them, shouldn't just be any pastor who's providing pastoral care. And a lot of churches might not have those resources internally. I mean, there's entire organizations that provide support and care for victims and their families. So as you work on that response plan that Jeff was talking about, what you want to do is identify, what do we have internally, what kind of training and support, what's available in the town, where can we go and build the relationships so that you can put together a package of victim care that's very professionally done, even if you don't have it available within the congregation. Another point to consider about victim care and trauma, it's a very long game. This is not going to be a situation where people need support and care for a couple of weeks or even for a couple of months. And as the situation changes, the types of care that they're going to need is going to change. I want to also emphasize Rob's point about if the offender is around the victim, even during the allegations phase, but especially later, once you've sorted out the facts, it would typically be re-traumatizing for a victim of some kind of abuse to have to see and confront the offender, say at her church, for example. And so, except in very rare circumstances, normally the ongoing pastoral care or even the church that they go to, that's going to have to be determined with that in mind. So even if you worked through, say, some of the material that Rob's provided on when sex offenders can go to the church, even if you felt good about having met those points, it still might be a bar because you've got a victim in your church that just doesn't need to be around that person from a trauma-informed perspective. And then the different stages that we've referenced briefly. So there's, when law enforcement or CPS is doing their investigation, what kind of support and care are you providing to children who may have been harmed, or depending on their age, maybe more to their families than to them? That can go on a long time. It could be months and months, even over a year, before something gets taken to trial. So you've really got to be in it for the long haul. And then if you get into a church disciplinary process, that's a completely different type of care. And if you're providing care, pastoral care for a person accused or their family, in essence, the people providing care for people who have been harmed and care for people who have been accused need to be different from each other. And they also need to not be the same people who are tasked with making administrative and disciplinary decisions. But you don't want to wind up with confidentiality conflicts or role conflicts. And a person who's a victim needs to feel that she or he is getting personalized, very professional care directed to that person without a lot of distractions and other obligations. And then once the law enforcement or CPS investigation is over, the situation's starting to settle down, you may still have safety plans to think about to keep people from being harmed. But as I mentioned before, the trauma-informed care, working through things for the victim and for that child's family, in some ways it's forever, and you can't just drop them and go away. And even the acute phase, that is going to go on a long time. So don't stop too soon providing care, or people are going to feel abandoned.